A couple who, despite difficulties, restored their relationship and built a strong family. Mark and Alice met in Austin, Texas, when they were both in their early 30s. They worked in different office buildings, but they went to the same coffee shop every day. After a few weeks of casual glances and smiles, Mark finally decided to talk. 6 months later, they started living together, and a year later they were married. Both were completely ordinary people without great ambitions, but with a clear desire to have a stable life. Mark worked in digital advertising, spent a lot of time in front of a monitor, was used to monotony. Alice was an assistant at a law firm. She didn't like her job, but she coped. She didn't complain. They didn't have many friends, but on the weekends they often went out of town, sometimes watched TV shows, sometimes sat silently on the porch together. Their life was calm, predictable, and at the same time a little boring. Everything changed in mid-November. Alice bought a pregnancy test after a missed period. When the result came back positive, she showed no emotion. She simply left the test on the edge of the bathtub, then washed her hands, went out into the backyard, and sat on the swing for a long time, looking up at the gray sky. That evening, she told Mark that she was pregnant. He was surprised, delighted, hugged her, and said that it was the best news he had heard in a long time. For the next few weeks, Alice behaved in a reserved manner. She didn't talk about the baby, didn't look for names, didn't share her condition. Mark assumed it was because she was tired or afraid. He bought juices, made lunches, made her doctor's appointments, and drove her to appointments himself. Alice accepted everything, but with concentration and detachment. At 8 weeks pregnant, she said she wanted a divorce. No arguments, no accusations. She simply said that it would be better this way. Mark didn't immediately know whether she was joking or having an emotional breakdown. But her face was calm. She didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I can't live with you anymore. I've decided." Mark tried to find out the reason. She answered briefly, "There is no one else, she doesn't go to anyone, she doesn't want a future together. She said she wants to raise the child on her own." Mark suggested going to a family psychologist, temporary separation, vacation. She refused. He didn't sleep for several nights in a row. He sat in the kitchen, looking through photos, trying to remember moments that could have become turning points. He asked himself if he could have done something wrong, if he had neglected something important. All his thoughts revolved around one thing: why did she want to break up now, when they had become parents? After long arguments and silence, Alice moved to a rented apartment on the other side of the city. She took a minimum of things, left her wedding ring on the bedside table in the bedroom. Mark woke up the next morning and saw that she was gone. The house was quiet. The clock in the kitchen was ticking loudly. There was a container of vegetables in the refrigerator, and her pot of lavender on the windowsill. He didn't call her for the first week. Then he wrote. She replied formally. She didn't forbid him from participating in the pregnancy, but she asked him not to pressure her. They made appointments with the doctor, which they attended together, although there was an invisible wall between them. They were silent in the car. At the appointments, they listened to the doctor, nodded. Afterward, they each went their separate ways. When the second trimester arrived, Alice's belly became more noticeable. She looked tired, pale, almost absent. Mark tried to be there, offering help, bringing groceries, leaving them at the door of her apartment. Sometimes she opened and took the packages herself. Sometimes she left them until the evening. She didn't invite him inside. Mark learned how to cook healthy meals for pregnant women, read books about parenting, and made a financial plan for the coming year. He even gave up a few projects at work to have more free time. But Alice kept her distance. At 20 weeks, they went for an ultrasound together. The doctor said it would be a boy. Mark smiled, trying to catch Alice's eye, but she stared at the screen, showing no emotion. After the appointment, she said she had already chosen a name, Nicholas. Mark nodded. He would have liked to talk it over together, but he knew now was not the time to argue. At home, he sat on the couch for several hours, thinking about how to turn it all around. He looked through photos of them together, reread old messages. All these little things now seemed like memories from another life. A month later, Alice was hospitalized with high blood pressure. She had to stay there for a few days for observation. Mark spent almost all of that time by her side. He sat in the hallway, brought her water, helped call the nurse. At night, he fell asleep on a chair, holding the phone in his hand so as not to miss her call. Alice let him be near her then. She even talked to him a little about the weather, about the hospital food, about how she would raise her son. She spoke calmly, as if she was planning this life without him, but without malice. Mark listened to her and felt his heart break. After discharge, she kept her distance again. She allowed him to take her for checkups, carry groceries, help with things, but the wall between them only grew stronger. Autumn came. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold wind. Mark understood that the birth of a child would not change her decision. He arranged a small room in his house for Nicholas, put a crib, bought soft blankets, decorated the wall with drawings. He wanted to be ready, even if Alice decided to give him the baby for the weekend or for a few hours. In the last weeks of her pregnancy, she had let him be present at the birth. It had been unexpected, and Mark had seen it as a small, fragile bridge between them. He had held her hand as she screamed in pain as the doctors rushed around the room. He had seen their son come into the world, small, wrinkled, loud. Alice had held Nicholas in her arms for a few minutes, then handed him to Mark. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were empty. She said she needed time to think things through. After she was discharged, Alice had returned to her apartment with Nicholas. Mark had come every day to change diapers, bathe the baby, bring formula. He had tried to be helpful, not intrusive. Alice had allowed it, but she had kept her distance. One of these nights proved to be a turning point. Nicholas would not stop crying, he had a fever. Alice sat on the floor by the crib, holding her head in her hands. She looked exhausted, broken. Mark took Nicholas in his arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and began to rock him, to soothe him. Alice watched this for a few minutes, then got up, left the room, and sat in the kitchen for a long time. She said nothing. She just drank water in small sips. When Mark brought the sleeping baby, she took him in silence. After that, she began to let Mark stay overnight more often. At first, to help with feeding, then simply to be there. They no longer discussed the future. They lived in the present. The winter in Austin was mild but windy. The windows of the apartment often misted up, and the wind whistled at night. Mark stayed more often. He learned to make porridge for Nicholas, to change diapers on time, to recognize his cries. He changed. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, but he never complained. Every day, every waking up in the middle of the night because of the baby's crying, he perceived as a chance to be a part of his son's life and to maintain a presence in Alice's life. She gradually became calmer around him. Sometimes she left him with Nicholas alone for a few hours, sometimes she asked for help without any explanation. They were like two people building something new without saying it out loud. Mark didn't ask questions. He just stayed where he was needed. One day, when Nicholas was 3 months old, Alice suggested that Mark take the baby for the weekend. It was something new. He agreed. They handed each other a backpack with things, bottles, little pajamas. He brought Nicholas to his house, where he had prepared a room back in the fall. Those 2 days were the best in a long time. Mark spent hours walking around the park with his stroller, taking pictures of the first snow on his son's tiny fingers. At night, he sat by the crib, watching his baby breathe. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living a full life. After the weekend, Alice was grateful, though short on words. She began to trust him more. They agreed on a schedule. Mark would help around the house 3 days a week and take Nicholas to his place 2 more. Alice was left alone with her son the rest of the days. Mark gradually returned to work. His manager gave him the opportunity to work remotely. He worked nights when Nicholas was asleep, or with a laptop on his lap while the baby played on the floor next to him. His life became simple and clear: son, work, helping Alice. In the spring, Alice's behavior changed. She began to smile more. Sometimes she laughed when Nicholas pulled her hair. Sometimes she called Mark herself, not just about childcare, but just like that. Their short conversations became calmer, easier. One evening, when Mark was bringing Nicholas home from the weekend, Alice suggested they stay for dinner. She made a simple pasta and salad. They ate in the kitchen in silence. But this silence was different, not cold, but homely. From then on, they began to spend more time together. Shared dinners, walks with their son, cartoon nights. They didn't discuss the past or make big plans. They were just together. One day, when Nicholas was 6 months old, Alice told Mark that she couldn't imagine raising her son without his participation. She didn't apologize for everything that had happened. She didn't promise anything. She just shared her feelings. Mark accepted it. Without complaints. Without unnecessary questions. He knew that the past could not be undone. But a new life could be created. It's simple, honest, and filled with caring. For Nicholas. Months passed. They continued to live separately, but they grew closer to each other every day. Alice often left Mark to spend the night, and later she herself stayed with him for the weekends with her son. Their rhythm was calm and natural. By Nicholas's first birthday, they rented a small house by the lake together and spent the weekends there. Mark, Alice, and their son are a family that has gone through a breakup, pain, and doubts, but has stayed together on new terms. There, on the shore, as Nicholas took his first steps in the sand, Mark and Alice felt for the first time in a long time that they could trust each other. Without promises, without oaths. Simply because of their shared love for the little life they had created. They didn't know if they would return to an official relationship. But they knew that they would remain a family. And that was enough. After returning from the lake, their lives took on a new rhythm. They were in no hurry to define their relationship. Mark still had his own apartment, Alice stayed in hers, but they spent most of the week together. Their things intertwined. Mark's toothbrush stood in Alice's bathroom, her coffee cup stood in his kitchen. No one planned it. It happened naturally. Nicholas grew up an active and cheerful boy. He laughed a lot, ran after the ball in the yard, tried to repeat his first words. Mark and Alice took him to the pediatrician together, picked out new toys together, cleaned up the blocks that were scattered on the floor together. That summer, they took their first short trip together to the coast in South Carolina. They stayed at a small hotel by the ocean, ate ice cream, and built sandcastles. Mark bought a camera and took dozens of photos of Nicholas every day. Alice laughed when she saw Mark making his son smile for the camera by singing funny songs. Sometimes Mark found himself thinking that he was happy. Not like in movies or books. His happiness was simple, watching his son fall asleep in his mother's arms, cooking dinner together, sitting on the porch and listening to the crickets. Fall brought new changes. Nicholas went to daycare a few times a week. Alice went back to work at a law firm, but part-time. Mark took on more of the household chores. They learned to be flexible, to help each other without being asked. One evening, while Nicholas slept in his room at Mark's house, Alice sat on the sofa with a cup of tea. She looked tired but calm. She said she had been thinking about moving in with Nicholas. No strings attached, no rush. Just to try to be together again under the same roof. Mark agreed. He didn't ask questions, he didn't demand promises. He knew that life was fragile, that everything could change at any moment. But he also knew that this moment was real. The move happened gradually. Alice brought boxes of things, Nicholas's toys, the books she read to him before bed. She wasn't in a hurry to give up her apartment completely, but with each passing week she returned there less and less often. They divided the responsibilities. Mark made breakfast, Alice picked up Nicholas from kindergarten. On weekends, they cleaned the house together, had little picnics in the yard, or went to nearby parks. Their life wasn't perfect. There were arguments over trifles, misunderstandings, fatigue. But now they knew how to listen to each other and understand when to take a step back. Winter brought rain and a cold wind. Mark bought a Christmas tree and decorated it in the living room with Alice and Nicholas. They hung homemade decorations on the tree that Nicholas had made in the garden. In the evenings they sat in the dimly lit room and watched the lights twinkle on the branches. For Christmas, Mark gave Alice a small box. Inside was a thin silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Family is where the heart is." Alice held the bracelet in her hands for a long time. Then carefully put it on her wrist. She didn't say a word. Her look said more than any promises. They celebrated the new year together, at home. Nicholas fell asleep long before midnight. They sat on the sofa, holding cups of warm tea, listening to fireworks exploding somewhere in the city. Alice rested her head on Mark's shoulder. He put one arm around her. They didn't make any wishes, they didn't plan for the future. They were simply here and now. Their life was simple and real. And that was enough. The following months passed peacefully. Nicholas grew up quickly, explored the world around him, asked countless questions, fell and got up, laughed and cried. Mark and Alice went through each of his stages together, the first sentences, the first friends, the first whims. In the spring, they decided to finally rent Alice's apartment and move completely into Mark's house. They turned one of the rooms into a playroom for Nicholas, bright walls, shelves with books, boxes with construction sets and cars. This decision was not spontaneous, it matured slowly, like everything in their relationship. Summer brought new adventures. They traveled by car across several states, spent the night in campsites, taught Nicholas to swim in small rivers. Alice and Mark learned not to rush. They allowed themselves to simply enjoy their time together. Autumn became special. Nicholas went to full-time kindergarten. For the first time in a long time, the house was empty during the day. Mark and Alice spent this time in different ways. Working, doing their own things, walking around the city. But sometimes they just sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee and sharing their thoughts about everything in the world. Mark noticed how Alice was changing. She became calmer, softer. There was no longer that painful anxiety in her eyes that he remembered from the beginning of her pregnancy. She learned to trust herself, him, life. He changed too. Responsibility for Nicholas hardened him. He no longer ran after unattainable goals, did not try to prove something to the world. His happiness was here, in children's laughter, in Alice's gaze, in quiet evenings at home. On the third anniversary of Nicholas's birthday, they threw a small party in the yard. Neighbors, friends from kindergarten, colleagues came. There were lots of balloons, a cake in the shape of a steam train, and children's laughter. Alice held Nicholas in her arms, and Mark filmed everything on camera. In the evening, when the guests had left, they sat on the porch and watched their son fall asleep in his high chair, tired and happy. Alice smiled and said that they had done well. Mark nodded. He knew that their path had been difficult, full of mistakes and pain. But they had found their own way to be a family. Without promises, without big words. Just daily work, support and trust. In the winter, they had first seriously talked about making their relationship official. Without a big wedding, without guests. Just signing the marriage certificate at the city hall, just the two of them, with Nicholas. They took their time. Not because they doubted it, but because they knew that they had time. They were already a family in everything but the formalities. In the spring, they did apply. On the day of the ceremony, Alice wore a simple ivory dress. And Mark wore a navy suit. Nicholas was wearing a little jacket and tie that he was so proud of. They arrived at the city hall, 3 of them. The ceremony was short. After signing the papers, Nicholas clapped his hands and laughed. Mark and Alice held hands, looked at each other, and felt that this time everything was right. They celebrated with lunch at a small cafe nearby. Then they went for a walk in the park. Nicholas ran ahead, throwing stones in the pond, calling his parents to look at the ducks. That evening, at home, after Nicholas had fallen asleep in his room, Mark and Alice sat on the couch, hugging each other. They remembered everything they had been through. Everything they had experienced together. They knew that there would be many more difficulties ahead. But they also knew that together they could get through anything. And that was all they needed to know. The next few years passed by without them noticing. Nicholas grew up quickly, absorbed new knowledge, made new friends, discovered the world for himself. His character was formed under the influence of love and attention, with which Mark and Alice surrounded him. Mark remained to work from home, building a career in the field of information technology. He learned to combine work and parenthood. He planned meetings in such a way as to have time to pick up Nicholas from school, take him to training, help with homework. Alice gradually returned to full-time work, but she no longer gave it her all, as she had before. Her priorities became family and the balance between career and personal life. She learned to set boundaries, to say no where before she tried to please everyone. They spent every weekend together. Sometimes they went to nature, sometimes they stayed at home, made pancakes for breakfast and built pillow forts with Nicholas. They developed their own traditions, Sunday walks in the park, board game nights, Christmas evenings with a joint viewing of old films. Over the years, Mark and Alice became even closer. Their trust in each other grew stronger through shared worries, joys and small victories. They experienced illnesses, fatigue, worries about their son's future, but they always remained a team. When Nicholas turned 7, they threw him his first big birthday party, with lots of guests, quests, and a pirate ship cake. Watching their son happily run around among his friends, Mark and Alice felt proud of the journey they had taken together. In the evening, when the party was over and the house was filled with peace, they sat next to each other on the couch again. Now it had become their place of strength, a simple reminder that together they would overcome anything. One summer day, they went with their whole family to a national park. Nicholas ran along the trails with enthusiasm, looking at the trees, rocks, and rivers. Mark and Alice followed, holding hands. They no longer discussed their relationship. Their love was in every gesture, every look, every moment they spent together. In the evening, they sat by the fire. Nicholas dozed, wrapped in a blanket. The starry sky opened up above them. Mark looked at Alice and understood everything that had happened. In their lives had made sense. All the doubts, fears, disappointments, everything had led them to this moment. He reached out and touched her hand. Alice looked at him and smiled. Without words. Without promises. Simply because she felt the same way. Time passed. Nicholas grew up. They spent his first day of high school together. Learning to accept his independence and his own decisions. They supported him in everything, in his first sports passions, in his first loves, in his first disappointments from failures. When Nicholas received his high school diploma, they sat on the podium, holding hands. They watched as their son, now almost an adult, received his diploma, and remembered how it all began. From a small apartment in Austin, from doubts and fears, from the first steps of trust in each other. In the evening, when the celebration was over, they sat together again on the porch of their house. Now it was a large, spacious house with a garden, built over years of work and love. Mark looked at Alice, who was sitting next to him, and at Nicholas, who was laughing inside with his friends. He knew everything was right. The life they had built together was real, deep, and unbreakable. And they didn't need to know anything more. A few years later, the house they lived in was filled with new sounds. Nicholas had grown up, entered college in another city, and came home only for the holidays. The house became quieter, calmer, but not empty. It still had many traces of his childhood, old toys in the attic, height marks on the doorposts, photographs on the walls. Mark and Alice, left alone, did not lose the rhythm of life. They took short trips to other states, walked in parks, tried new restaurants. Instead of parental duties, simple joys appeared at the center, morning walks, reading together on the terrace, evenings with music and candles. Alice began to do more gardening. She grew tomatoes, basil, strawberries. Mark set up a workshop in the garage, where he worked with wood, creating furniture and frames for family photos. They did not seek adventure, did not try to escape from everyday life. On the contrary, they lived it with respect and gratitude. There was a place in their lives for meetings with friends, visits with relatives, helping neighbors. They became part of a community to which they truly belonged. In the evenings, they sometimes just sat by the fireplace, silently looking at the fire. The silence between them no longer meant awkwardness, it was warm and profound. When Nicholas graduated, he returned home for a few months. He was different, older, more independent, but there was still something childish about his gestures. That evening, when they all had dinner together in the backyard, Mark and Alice looked at him with pride. He had the meaning of their years in every word he said, in every choice he made. After dinner, Nicholas said he had found a job in the big city. It was far away, but he was sure of his decision. Alice nodded, smiling, and said it was another step in life. Mark squeezed her hand. They both understood, he was leaving forever. But it wasn't a loss. It was a continuation. When his son left, the house fell silent again. But this time it didn't feel empty. It was calm. Mature. They both knew that this stage of life was not worse, but simply different. One morning, Mark and Alice decided to go to the same lake where, many years ago, they had first felt that they could trust each other again. Everything there had changed, new buildings, different trees, different people. But the shore remained the same. They sat on a bench by the water, holding hands, and watched the waves gently touch the sand. Mark felt at peace. Everything they had been through had been worth it. Everything had made sense, from the pain at the beginning to the silence now. He looked at Alice. She was also looking out at the lake, her hair fluttering in the wind, and in her eyes there was a shadow of the same power that had once brought her back to him. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was the life they had lived together. From the first doubt to the last look at the calm lake. And that was all they needed to know. A year after the trip to the lake, Alice and Mark celebrated 30 years of marriage. They didn't throw any big parties, they didn't invite guests. They just woke up in the morning, made coffee, went out onto the terrace and sat next to each other, wrapped in blankets. The world was quiet. The leaves rustled in the garden, a bird sang somewhere in the branches. They didn't talk, they were just there. That was enough to feel happy. After breakfast, they looked through old photo albums. Photos from their youth, Alice's pregnancy, Nicholas' first steps, family holidays, ordinary everyday life. Their life was on these pages, without filters, without embellishment. Real. In the evening, they went out into the yard, hung garlands, lit candles and had dinner in the open air. Nicholas called by video call, he congratulated them, told them about his new job, promised to come next month. They listened to him, smiled and were proud. He was their greatest shared story. Late in the evening, when the world faded into silence, they returned to the house. Mark turned off the lights, and they went to bed. Alice leaned towards him, as she had done so many years ago. He kissed her on the forehead. And in that moment, everything about them was calm. Not because life had become easier, but because they had lived it to the fullest, with pain and joy, loss and love, mistakes and forgiveness.